A storm is brewing. New York, 1922. Margaret Calloway kept James Calloway's broken pocket watch in a locked drawer. But when she opened it tonight, the hands had started moving only backward, ticking steadily toward the moment he had gone missing. Chapter 1. The Dust of Memory. The brownstone felt colder than usual, despite the late spring warmth that had finally begun to permeate New York City. Margaret Calloway traced the worn floral pattern of the wallpaper in the hallway, her fingers catching on a small tear near the baseboard. It had been there for years, a tiny imperfection she'd always meant to fix, but like so many things, it had been left undone. Just like James. She paused at the mahogany desk in her late husband's study, a room she rarely entered anymore. The scent of pipe tobacco, faint but persistent, still clung to the heavy velvet curtains and leather-bound books. It was a ghost of a scent, a reminder of a life that had been abruptly, cruelly, severed. For years since the telegram had arrived, its stark words blurring through her tears, missing in action. Presumed. She hadn't allowed herself to finish reading it then, and she still couldn't. The drawer, the one she always kept locked, beckoned. Inside, nestled amongst old receipts, faded photographs, and a dried sprig of lavender, lay James's pocket watch. It was a simple silver piece, unremarkable except for the inscription on the back, "Time waits for no man, but I'll wait for you. Always, J." He'd given it to her on their first anniversary, a playful grin lighting up his usually serious face. She hadn't touched the watch since the day she'd packed away his belongings, her hands shaking so violently she'd nearly dropped it. Locking it away felt like locking away the last tangible piece of him, a finality she hadn't been ready to face. But tonight, a restless unease had settled over her, a prickling at the back of her neck that wouldn't be ignored. Her fingers fumbled with the small key, the lock clicking open with a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the silent room. The watch lay nestled in its velvet-lined box, gleaming dully in the dim light. She lifted it out, the cold metal heavy in her palm. It was heavier than she remembered. Or perhaps she was weaker. Margaret held her breath and flipped open the cover. The hands were still. Of course, they were still. It had been broken for years, a casualty of a clumsy moment on a cobblestone street in Paris during their honeymoon. James had laughed it off, claiming it was a sign they should live in the moment, unburdened by time. A bitter smile touched her lips. He'd always had a way of romanticizing even the most mundane things. And then she saw it. A flicker. A twitch. The second hand, impossibly, moved backward. She blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. It must be a trick of the light, a figment of her grief-addled mind. She rubbed her eyes, her fingers trembling. But when she looked again, the hand was still moving, ticking steadily, relentlessly, in the wrong direction. Counterclockwise. Against the natural order of things. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. This wasn't possible. Watches didn't run backward. Dead watches, especially, didn't suddenly spring back to life, defying the laws of physics and reason. But the watch continued its backward journey, each tick a tiny hammer blow against the fragile walls she'd built around her heart. It was as if time itself was rewinding, peeling back the layers of years, drawing her back to what? To James? To the war? To the moment everything had shattered? She stared at the watch, mesmerized and terrified. The room felt colder now, the scent of tobacco replaced by a sharp, metallic tang, like the smell of rain on cold steel. She thought of the trenches, the mud, the endless, deafening roar of artillery fire, images she'd only glimpsed in newspapers, but which had haunted her dreams for years. James had never spoken much about the war, his letters carefully censored, his words chosen to reassure, to protect her from the horrors he faced. But the watch was speaking. It was telling a story she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. A story written in reverse, in the language of lost time and broken promises. The second hand continued its relentless backward march. Each tick was a whisper, a summons. And Margaret knew, with a chilling certainty, that she had no choice but to follow where it led. The past, it seemed, was not yet finished with her. It was calling her back. And perhaps James was calling too. Chapter 2. A crack in the facade. The rhythmic tick-tock, now a constant counterpoint to the frantic beat of her own heart, echoed in the otherwise silent house. Margaret closed the watch cover. The sound a small, sharp snap in the stillness, but the backward movement continued, visible now only through the faint vibrations she felt through the cool silver casing. She slipped the watch into the pocket of her dress, the weight of it a constant, unsettling presence against her thigh. Sleep was impossible. She paced the confines of her bedroom, the familiar floral wallpaper now seeming to mock her with its cheerful, unchanging pattern. The city outside was settling into its nightly rhythm, the distant rumble of a passing trolley, the faint strains of jazz music from a nearby speakeasy, the occasional shout, but inside the brownstone, time was unraveling. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the watchmaker, old Mr. Abernathy on Bleecker Street, had somehow, miraculously, fixed it. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. Mr. Abernathy had been a meticulous craftsman, but he was no magician. And he certainly wouldn't have set the hands to move backward. Besides, he had passed away 2 years ago. His shop was now a millinery, filled with frivolous hats and gossiping women. Margaret stopped in front of the mirror above her dressing table. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and drawn, her eyes wide and shadowed with a fear she hadn't felt since those agonizing weeks waiting for news from the front. She looked older than her 38 years. The lines around her eyes, etched by worry and grief, seemed deeper tonight, as if the backward ticking watch was aging her in reverse, peeling back not just time, but the carefully constructed facade of composure she'd worn for so long. She had become adept at playing the role of the grieving widow, the brave woman who carried on with quiet dignity. She attended the charity luncheons, the society teas, the occasional concert at Carnegie Hall. She smiled, she nodded, she made polite conversation. She had even, on a few occasions, allowed herself to be courted by well-meaning, if somewhat dull, suitors. But it was all a performance, a carefully choreographed dance designed to keep the world at bay, to protect the fragile, wounded core of her being. The war had taken more than just James. It had taken her sense of security, her belief in the future, her ability to trust. It had left her adrift in a sea of uncertainty, clinging to the wreckage of her former life. She touched the cool glass of the mirror, her fingertips tracing the outline of her reflection. Beneath the surface, beneath the polite smiles and the carefully chosen words, lay a well of grief so deep, so vast, that she feared she might drown in it. A sudden, sharp knock on the front door startled her. Her heart leaped into her throat. Who could be calling at this hour? She glanced at the small clock on her bedside table. It was past midnight. Hesitantly, she made her way downstairs, her hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where the watch lay hidden. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her chest. Standing on her doorstep, silhouetted against the gaslight, was a man in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place him. He shifted slightly, and a glint of metal caught the light. A silver chain. A watch chain. A wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The watch in her pocket felt suddenly hot, burning against her skin. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. But the impossible, it seemed, was becoming her new reality. The man at the door was carrying a message. She was certain of it, whether she liked it or not. Chapter 3. Whispers from the front. Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The rational part of her brain screamed at her to call the police, to slam the door shut, to run and hide. But the insistent ticking of the watch in her pocket, relentless pulse against her thigh, urged her forward. It was a siren's call, a whisper from the past she couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and opened the door a crack, the chain still firmly in place. Yes, she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man tipped his hat, revealing a face that was both familiar and strangely altered. It was a face she had known intimately, a face that had haunted her dreams for years, but it was older, harder, etched with lines of weariness and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Mrs. Calloway?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, tinged with an accent she couldn't place. It wasn't James's voice, but the eyes were undeniably his. The same deep blue, the same intensity, the same flicker of something that might have been humor, or perhaps pain. "James?" she whispered, the name a fragile prayer on her lips. The man hesitated. "Not exactly," he said, his gaze shifting away from hers. "But I have a message." From him. Margaret felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This wasn't a reunion, it was a reckoning. "A message? From the front?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. The war had been over for years. How could there be a message now? "From a place beyond the front," the man corrected, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A place where time bends." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. It was addressed to her, in James's unmistakable handwriting. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as if it had aged centuries, not years. He asked me to deliver this," the man said, extending the envelope towards her. "He said you would understand." Margaret's hand shook as she reached for the letter, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was cold, unnaturally so, like marble. She quickly drew back, her heart pounding. Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated again. "A friend," he said finally. "A messenger. That's all you need to know." He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing on the stone steps. Margaret watched him go, her mind reeling. She wanted to call him back, to demand answers, to understand the impossible reality that was unfolding before her. But she knew, instinctively, that he wouldn't, or couldn't, tell her more. She closed the door, leaning against it for support, her legs trembling. The envelope felt heavy in her hand, a tangible link to a past she thought was lost forever. She looked down at the inscription, at James's familiar handwriting, and a wave of grief, so intense it was almost physical, washed over her. She tore open the envelope, her fingers clumsy with urgency. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching in her throat as she began to read. The words were written in pencil, smudged and faded, but still legible. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then time has done its work. Or perhaps undone it. I don't know how this is possible, but I know that it is. I am writing to you from a place beyond the veil, a place where the living and the dead meet. A place where time flows differently. I have so much to tell you, so much I left unsaid. But I fear this letter is my only chance. My only chance to ask for your forgiveness. My only chance to tell you the truth. The truth about the war. The truth about my mission. The truth about everything." The letter ended abruptly, as if he had been interrupted, or as if his time, even in this strange, timeless realm, had run out. Margaret stared at the unfinished words, her mind racing. What truth? What mission? What had James been hiding from her? The watch in her pocket ticked louder, faster, as if urging her to seek the answers. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this letter was just the beginning. The beginning of a journey into the past, into the heart of a mystery that was far more complex and far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. A truth so terrible was scratching to be free. Chapter 4. The Telegram Shadow. Margaret sank into the worn armchair in James's study, the letter clutched in her trembling hand. The words swam before her eyes, blurring with the tears she could no longer hold back. A place beyond the veil, where time flows differently, it was the language of dreams, of madness. Yet, the tangible proof, the letter, the watch, the mysterious messenger was undeniable. She reread the letter, searching for clues, for any hint of what James had been trying to tell her. My mission. That phrase resonated with a chilling familiarity. James had always been secretive about his work for the government, even before the war. He'd spoken vaguely of intelligence gathering, of serving his country. She'd accepted his explanations, trusting in his love, in his inherent goodness. But now, doubt gnawed at her. She remembered the telegram, the one that had shattered her world. It had been so brief, so impersonal, missing in action. Presumed she'd never allowed herself to finish that sentence, to accept the finality of those words. She'd clung to the hope, however faint, that he was still alive, that he would somehow find his way back to her. But the telegram had cast a long shadow, a shadow that had darkened every aspect of her life. It had colored her memories, turning even the happiest moments bittersweet. She'd questioned everything, wondering if she'd ever truly known the man she'd married. She rose and walked over to the bookshelf, her fingers trailing along the spines of the leather-bound volumes. James had been an avid reader, devouring books on history, philosophy, and espionage. She pulled out a volume on cryptography, its pages filled with complex codes and ciphers. Had this been part of his mission? Had he been involved in something more dangerous than she'd ever imagined? A small, folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. She picked it up, her heart quickening. It was a photograph, a faded image of James in his uniform, standing in front of a bombed-out building. He looked younger, thinner, his eyes haunted by a weariness she hadn't seen in the photographs he'd sent her from the front. On the back of the photograph, there was a single word, written in pencil. Verdun.
Verdun.
The name sent a shiver down her spine. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, a place of unimaginable horror and suffering. James had never mentioned being there. His letters had always spoken of safer locations, of rear echelon duties. She sank back into the armchair, the photograph and the letter clutched in her hands. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, forming a picture that was both terrifying and strangely compelling. James had lied to her. He'd kept secrets from her. And those secrets, it seemed, were now reaching out from beyond the grave, demanding to be revealed. The watch in her pocket ticked steadily backward, a constant reminder of the unraveling of time, of the blurring of the lines between the living and the dead. She felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she was being drawn into something dangerous, something she might not be able to control. But she also felt a flicker of something else, a spark of determination. She had to know the truth. She had to find out what had happened to James, what his mission had been, and why he had felt the need to ask for her forgiveness. She owed it to him. She owed it to herself. And she owed it to the backward ticking watch, the strange, impossible artifact that had opened a door to a past she thought was closed forever. She resolved that she would keep going, no matter how dangerous. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The weight of the watch was a promise now. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Rain. The rain began just as Margaret left the brownstone, a steady downpour that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the damp chill seeping into her bones. The city streets, usually bustling with activity, were nearly deserted, the only sounds the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the pavement and the occasional hiss of a passing car. She headed towards the public library, the Grand Beaux-Arts building on Fifth Avenue, a beacon of knowledge and, she hoped, answers. She needed to learn more about Verdun, about the specific battles that had taken place there, about the secret operations that might have been conducted under the cover of the chaos. The library was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. She found a secluded alcove and began her research, poring over maps, military histories, and first-hand accounts of the battle. The more she read, the more horrified she became. Verdun was a meat grinder, a place where hundreds of thousands of men had died in a senseless struggle for a few miles of barren, shell-torn land. She searched for any mention of James, any clue that might connect him to the battle. But his name was nowhere to be found in the official records. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the fog of war. She found a book detailing the various intelligence agencies that had operated during the war, The clandestine networks of spies and saboteurs who had worked in the shadows, their actions often unacknowledged, their identities shrouded in secrecy. She learned about the Duxim Bureau, the French military intelligence agency, and its British counterpart, MI6. She wondered if James had been involved with one of these organizations, his mission a covert operation that had gone wrong. As she read, she became increasingly aware of a figure lurking in the periphery of her vision. A man, tall and thin, with a familiar long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was standing in the shadows, seemingly engrossed in a book, but she could feel his eyes on her. It was the messenger, the man from the night before. She hesitated, her heart pounding. Should she approach him? Demand answers? Or would that be too dangerous? She decided to wait, to observe. She pretended to continue reading, but her eyes kept darting back to the man in the shadows. He remained there for nearly an hour, never moving, never speaking. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Margaret rushed to the spot where he had been standing, but there was no trace of him. He had vanished like a ghost, leaving behind only a faint scent of rain and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of the watch. She returned to her alcove, feeling a growing sense of frustration and despair. She was chasing shadows, following a trail of clues that seemed to lead nowhere. The backward ticking watch, the cryptic letter, the mysterious messenger, it was all a tangled web, and she was caught in the center of it. As she was about to give up, she noticed a small, folded piece of paper lying on the floor where the man had been standing. She picked it up, her heart quickening. It was a page torn from a book, a page describing a specific unit that had fought at Verdun, a unit specializing in reconnaissance and espionage. At the bottom of the page, a single sentence had been underlined in pencil. This unit often recruited men with unique skills, including fluency in multiple languages and a willingness to take extreme risks. Margaret knew, with a chilling certainty, that she had found a clue. James had been fluent in French and German, and he had always possessed a certain recklessness, a willingness to push the boundaries. It seemed he'd been keeping more than just secrets. He'd been playing a double game, and the stakes were deadly. This unit was the key. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Kiss. The torn page felt like a burning coal in Margaret's hand. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like a cage. She needed to get out, to breathe, to think. She gathered her things and hurried out into the rain, the downpour now a torrential deluge that soaked her to the bone. She hailed a taxi, her mind racing. The unit mentioned on the page, it was a starting point, but it wasn't enough. She needed a name, a contact, someone who could tell her more about James's involvement, about his mission. An idea sparked in her mind. An old acquaintance of James's, a man named Arthur Davies, had worked for the War Department during the conflict. He'd been a quiet, unassuming man, but she remembered him having a sharp mind and a network of contacts that stretched across continents. He might be able to help. She directed the taxi to Davies's address in Greenwich Village, a narrow, winding street lined with brownstones similar to her own. The rain showed no sign of letting up, the streets now rivers of water, the gutters overflowing. Davies lived on the top floor of a walk-up, his apartment a cluttered mess of books, papers, and antique maps. He greeted her with surprise, his eyes widening behind his thick spectacles. He hadn't seen her since James's memorial service, 4 years ago. "Margaret," he said, his voice a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What brings you here? And in this weather?" She explained, haltingly, about the watch, the letter, the messenger, the torn page. Davies listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave. He didn't dismiss her story as the ramblings of a grief-stricken widow, as she had feared he might. Instead, he seemed to understand, to believe. James was involved in sensitive work, Davies said finally, his voice low. Work that required a great deal of discretion. He was recruited by a special unit, a unit that operated outside the normal chain of command. "The unit mentioned on this page?" Margaret asked, handing him the torn piece of paper. Davies examined it carefully. "Yes," he said. "The Serpents, they were called." A rather melodramatic name, but fitting. They were masters of deception, of infiltration, of getting things done. And James was one of them? Davies nodded. He was one of their best. He had a gift for languages, for blending in, for disappearing. He was sent on several missions deep behind enemy lines. But Verdun? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. He never mentioned being there. Verdun was different, Davies said, his gaze shifting away. It was a hell on earth. A place where even the serpents feared to tread. But James, he volunteered. He said he had a personal reason. A personal reason. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Margaret felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. What had James been searching for at Verdun? What had driven him to risk his life in that inferno? And who, exactly, was he working for? There was a duplicity here, a darker layer of deceit she was only just starting to comprehend. There was a rumor, Davies continued, his voice barely above a whisper. A rumor that James had betrayed his unit. That he had switched sides. Margaret gasped. Betrayed? No, that's impossible. James would never. I didn't believe it either, Davies said. But the evidence, it was compelling. He disappeared during a crucial mission. Information was leaked. Men died. The room began to spin. Margaret gripped the edge of a table, her knuckles white. Betrayal. The word echoed in her mind. A serpent's kiss, poisoning everything she thought she knew about James. The watch ticked, each tick a betrayal of a forgotten, broken promise. He had a debt to pay. To whom? Chapter 7. Scars on the Soul. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid aftermath of the storm. Margaret felt a wave of nausea, a physical rejection of the idea that James, her James, could have been a traitor. It was a betrayal not just of his country, but of her, of their love, of everything they had built together.
But why?
She managed to ask, her voice choked with emotion. Why would he do that? Davies sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. That's the question that has haunted me for years, he said. I've tried to find answers, to understand. But the serpents, they were masters of secrecy. Their records were either destroyed or classified. I could never get to the truth. He paused, looking at Margaret with a mixture of pity and concern. There were whispers, he continued, his voice low. Whispers of a woman. A French woman, involved with the German intelligence service. They said James had fallen for her. That she had turned him. A woman. Another layer of the onion. Another layer of pain. Margaret felt a sharp, stabbing sensation in her chest, a physical manifestation of the jealousy and betrayal that were consuming her. She had always known that James had been attractive to women, that he had possessed a certain charm, a certain magnetism. But she had trusted him, implicitly. Do you know her name? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Davies hesitated.
There were rumors, he said again.
But nothing concrete. Some said she was called Anya. Others said Isabella. It was all very vague. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. I kept a few notes, he said. Names, places, dates, anything that might shed some light on James's case. It's not much, but you're welcome to it. Margaret took the notebook, her hands trembling. It felt like a lifeline, a tangible connection to the mystery that was consuming her. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages filled with Davies's meticulous handwriting. She saw names she didn't recognize, code words, references to secret meetings, to clandestine operations. And then she saw it. A name, circled in red ink. Isabella Moreau. And beneath it, a single word. Verdun. The same name, the same place. The connection was undeniable. This Isabella Moreau, whoever she was, had been at Verdun. And she had been involved with James. Margaret closed the notebook, her mind racing. She had a name, a starting point. She had to find this woman, to confront her, to demand answers. She had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Thank you, Arthur, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You've given me hope, or at least a direction. Davies nodded, his expression somber. Be careful, Margaret, he said. The serpents, they were dangerous men. And their enemies even more so. You're walking into a world of shadows, a world where nothing is as it seems. His words were a warning, but they also fueled her determination. She had to uncover the truth, not just for James, but for herself. She had to understand the scars on his soul, the secrets he had carried, the choices he had made. As she left Davies's apartment, the rain had stopped. The city was washed clean, the air fresh and cool. But the storm within her raged on. The watch, silent for now, was a heavy weight in her pocket, a constant reminder of the journey ahead and the darkness she had to face and who she was becoming in that darkness. A woman with a mission. Chapter 8. The Unsent Letter. Back in the solitude of her brownstone, Margaret spread out the contents of Arthur Davies's notebook on James's desk. The faded ink, the cryptic notations, the sheer weight of unanswered questions pressed down on her. She felt a strange mix of dread and determination, a sense of being pulled inexorably towards a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She began to systematically examine the notes, cross-referencing them with the information she'd gleaned from the library and the torn page about the serpents. She focused on the entries related to Isabella Moreau, piecing together a fragmented picture of this mysterious woman. Isabella Moreau, it seemed, was a known associate of several high-ranking German officers. She was described as beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent. She had been seen in various locations across France, often in the company of military personnel. There were notes about her suspected involvement in espionage, in passing information to the enemy. But there was also something else, something that made Margaret's heart ache. There were references to Isabella's relationship with James, to their clandestine meetings, to their shared passion. The words were clinical, detached, but they painted a picture of intimacy, of a connection that went beyond mere professional collaboration. Margaret felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp, visceral pain that surprised her with its intensity. She had thought she was past that her grief had dulled the edges of her emotions. But the thought of James with another woman, of him sharing his secrets, his affections, with someone else, was almost unbearable. She found a small, sealed envelope tucked into the back of the notebook. It was addressed to James, in a handwriting she didn't recognize. The return address was simply, I am, Paris. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it. A letter from Isabella Moreau to James. A letter that might hold the key to the entire mystery. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the envelope. Opening it felt like a violation, a betrayal of trust. But she knew she had to do it. She had to know what had passed between them, what had driven James to make the choices he had made. With trembling fingers, she carefully broke the seal. The paper inside was thin and brittle, the ink faded and smudged. The letter was written in French, a language Margaret understood, but with difficulty. She began to translate, her heart sinking with each word. The letter was passionate, filled with longing and regret. Isabella wrote of their forbidden love, of their dangerous game, of their shared dreams. She spoke of the war, of the horrors she had witnessed, of the choices she had been forced to make. And then, she wrote of her betrayal. I did what I had to do, she wrote, to protect my family, to protect my country. I used you, James. I manipulated you. I gave them information that costs lives. I know you will never forgive me. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I loved you. I truly loved you. The letter ended there, abruptly, as if she had been interrupted, or as if she had simply run out of words. Margaret stared at the letter, her mind reeling. Isabella had confessed. She had admitted to using James, to betraying him, but she had also claimed to love him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was even more complex, more heartbreaking than she had imagined. James hadn't been a traitor, not in the way she had feared. He had been a victim, a pawn in a deadly game of espionage and love. But there was something missing, a crucial piece of the puzzle. The letter hadn't been sent. It had been found amongst Davies' notes, not in James' possession.
Why?
And what of the watch? Why did its hands turn back, if James' love, Isabella, confessed her crimes? The watch in her pocket began to tick again, louder this time, faster. It was urging her on, telling her that the journey was far from over. There was more to discover, more to understand. The unsent letter was a clue, not a conclusion. She sensed there was a truth, much closer to home, she needed to find. Chapter 9. A Dance of Deception. The ticking of the watch was a relentless drumbeat, driving Margaret forward. The unsent letter had answered some questions, but it had also raised new ones. Why hadn't Isabella sent it? Had she changed her mind? Had she been prevented from doing so? Or had she found another way to communicate with James, a way that was even more secret, more dangerous? Margaret decided to retrace her steps, to revisit the places that had held significance for James, hoping to find some clue, some overlooked detail that might shed light on the mystery. She started with their home, the brownstone they had shared for 5 years before the war. She searched his study again, going through his books, his papers, his personal belongings, with a renewed sense of purpose. She found nothing new, nothing that she hadn't seen before. But as she was about to give up, she noticed something odd about the bookshelf. One of the books, a volume of poetry by William Blake, was slightly out of place. It was sticking out a few inches further than the others. She pulled it out, her heart quickening. The book was hollowed out, its pages carefully cut to create a secret compartment. Inside, there was a small, rolled-up piece of paper. She unrolled it carefully, her hands trembling. It was a map, a detailed map of a small village in France near Verdun. The village was circled in red ink, and there were several markings on the map, indicating specific locations: a church, a farmhouse, a bridge. And then she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible inscription, written in James's handwriting, at the bottom of the map: Rendezvous. Midnight. October 26, 1918. The date sent a shiver down her spine. October 26, 1918. It was just days before James had been reported missing in action. This map, this rendezvous, it was connected to his disappearance, to his mission. But who was he meeting? Isabella? Someone else? And what was the purpose of the meeting? Margaret felt a growing sense of urgency. She had to find out what had happened at that rendezvous, what had gone wrong. She had to uncover the truth before it was too late. She decided to consult with Arthur Davies again. She needed his expertise, his knowledge of the serpents and their operations. She took a taxi back to his apartment, her mind racing, the map clutched tightly in her hand. Davies listened intently as she explained her discovery, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. He examined the map carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This village, it's called Beaumont-en-Verneuil," he said. "It was completely destroyed during the war. A ghost town. A perfect place for a secret meeting." "But who was James meeting?" Margaret asked.
And why?
Davies hesitated. "I don't know," he said. "But I have a feeling it wasn't Isabella Moreau." "Then who?" "Someone else," Davies said. "Someone who knew about the serpents, about James's mission. Someone who wanted him out of the way." He paused, looking at Margaret with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, "there's something I haven't told you. Something about James's disappearance. It can't be Isabella. She died a month before this rendezvous was meant to take place." The room began to spin. Margaret gripped the edge of a table, her knuckles white. Another betrayal. Another lie. The dance of deception was becoming a dizzying waltz, and she was losing her footing. This was no longer just about the war. Chapter 10. The Raven's Warning. Isabella's death, a month before James's disappearance, shattered the fragile framework Margaret had built around the mystery. If Isabella wasn't the one James was meeting at Beaumont-en-Verneuil, then who was? And what was the true nature of his mission? The layers of deception were deepening, obscuring the truth like a thick fog.
"How did she die?"
Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper, a sense of dread creeping over her. Davies hesitated, his gaze shifting away.
"It was unclear," he said.
The official report said she died of influenza. The Spanish flu was rampant at the time. But you don't believe that? Davies shook his head.
"No," he said.
"I don't. There were rumors, whispers that she was murdered, that she knew too much, that she was a liability." "To whom?" Margaret asked, her heart pounding. To the Germans, Davies said. Or to someone else. Someone who was playing both sides. He paused, looking at Margaret intently. Margaret, he said, his voice low. I think James was caught in a crossfire. A double cross. He was being used by both sides, and he didn't even know it. The implications of Davies's words were chilling. James, her brave, honorable James, had been a pawn in a much larger, much more sinister game. A game that had cost him his life. Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning rage directed at the unknown forces that had manipulated and destroyed him. She had to find out who was responsible, who had orchestrated his death. She had to avenge him. The map, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. The rendezvous. There must be something there, some clue that can lead us to the truth. Davies nodded. Perhaps, he said. But it's dangerous, Margaret. Very dangerous. Beaumont en Verdenoise is a haunted place. A place of ghosts and secrets. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, black book. This is a list of contacts, he said. People who might be able to help you. People who know things. But be careful, Margaret. Trust no one. Margaret took the book, her hand shaking. She knew she was walking into a dangerous world, a world of spies and assassins, a world where the lines between truth and deception were blurred. As she was about to leave, Davies stopped her. One more thing, Margaret, he said. There was a symbol that was often associated with the serpents and with their enemies. A raven. A black raven. A raven. The image sent a shiver down her spine. She remembered the messenger, the man who had delivered James's letter. He had worn a dark coat, like a raven's wing. And she remembered something else, a small, silver pin on his lapel. A pin shaped like a raven. She suddenly realized that the messenger hadn't just been delivering a letter. He had been delivering a warning from the past, a warning about the dangers that lay ahead, and a warning that she had, perhaps, been foolish to ignore until this moment. The raven was a symbol of death, but also a guide to the underworld. She had to find this man, this raven, and he had to be connected to the village. Chapter 11. Beneath the Lies. The image of the raven, a dark omen against the backdrop of James's tragic fate, haunted Margaret as she left Davies's apartment. The messenger, the man with the raven pin, was no longer just a fleeting figure in the periphery. He was a key player in this intricate game of deception, a link between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. She decided to return to the library, not to research the war, but to research the messenger himself. She remembered his accent, the way he had spoken, the subtle inflections that had hinted at his origins. It wasn't French, not quite. It was something else. Something closer to home. She spent hours poring over books on dialects, on regional accents, on the subtle nuances of language. And then she found it. A description of a particular accent, a blend of English and Scottish, spoken in a specific region of the British Isles. The Outer Hebrides. The Outer Hebrides. A remote, isolated archipelago off the coast of Scotland. A place of wild beauty and ancient secrets. A place where the veil between worlds was said to be thin. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. She decided to follow it, to travel to the Outer Hebrides, to find the messenger, to uncover his connection to James and to the raven symbol. She booked passage on a ship leaving for Scotland the following week, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She knew she was embarking on a dangerous journey, a journey into the unknown. But she was driven by a fierce determination to uncover the truth, to avenge James, to find peace. Before she left, she returned to the brownstone, to James's study. She stood before his desk, her hand resting on the worn surface, feeling the faint imprint of his presence. She felt a sense of connection to him, a sense of his spirit guiding her, urging her on. She opened the drawer where she had kept the watch, the backward ticking watch that had started this whole chain of events. She took it out, holding it in her palm, feeling its weight, its coldness. The watch was still ticking, still moving backward. But now, she noticed something different. The hands were slowing down, their movement becoming almost imperceptible. It was as if the watch was reaching its destination, as if time was catching up. She realized that the watch wasn't just a symbol of the past. It was a guide, a compass, pointing her towards the truth. And it was also a timer, counting down to a final reckoning. She tucked the watch into her pocket, feeling its weight against her thigh, a constant reminder of her mission. She was ready. She was prepared to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the ghosts of the past, to uncover the truth that lay buried beneath the lies. She wasn't the same woman who had opened the drawer a few short weeks before. Chapter 12. The Price of Freedom. The voyage to Scotland was long and arduous, the ship battling fierce winds and turbulent seas. Margaret spent most of the time in her cabin, poring over Davies's notebook, studying the map of Beaumont and Verdenoise, and trying to decipher the cryptic entries related to the serpents and their operations. She also thought about the messenger, about his accent, about the raven pin. She tried to piece together a profile of this mysterious man, to understand his motives, his connection to James. He was clearly a dangerous individual, but who was he working for? And was it possible he had some idea of the backward ticking watch? As the ship approached the Outer Hebrides, Margaret felt a growing sense of unease. The landscape was stark and desolate, the islands shrouded in mist, the sea a churning gray expanse. It was a place of wild beauty, but also a place of isolation, a place where secrets could easily be hidden. She disembarked at Stornoway, the main town on the Isle of Lewis, a bustling port filled with fishing boats and the cries of seagulls. She found a small, modest guest house, a place where she could blend in, where she could observe and gather information. She began her search for the messenger, asking discreet questions at the local pubs, at the docks, at the market. She described his appearance, his accent, the raven pin. But no one seemed to know him, or if they did, they weren't willing to talk. She felt a sense of frustration, a feeling that she was chasing a ghost. But she refused to give up. She knew he was here, somewhere, hiding in the shadows. One evening, as she was walking along the harbor, she saw a familiar figure standing on the pier, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was the messenger, the man with the raven pin. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding. He turned to face her, his eyes, the same intense blue as James's, fixed on hers. "You've been following me," he said, his voice a low rumble, the Hebridean accent thick and unmistakable. "I need to talk to you," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "About James Calloway." The man's expression didn't change.
"I don't know any James Calloway," he said.
"You delivered a letter to me," Margaret said. "A letter from him. From beyond." The man hesitated. I was asked to deliver a message," he said. "That's all." "Who asked you?" Margaret demanded. "Who are you working for?" The man looked around, as if checking to see if they were being observed.
"I can't tell you that," he said.
"It's dangerous." "My husband is dead," Margaret said, her voice rising in anger. "He was murdered. And I believe you know something about it." The man's gaze shifted away. I know he was involved in something dangerous," he said. "Something that cost him his life." He looked at Margaret sadly and added, "The price of freedom is high." "Tell me," Margaret pleaded. "Tell me what happened at Beaumont and Verdenoise." The man hesitated again. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "I can't tell you everything," he said. "But I can tell you this: James Calloway was not a traitor. He was a hero. He sacrificed himself to save others." The raven began to walk away, then paused. He looked directly at Margaret, with a strange, unsettling look in his eyes.
"And he knew about the watch," he said.
"He knew." Then he vanished into the gathering dusk. Chapter 13. Threads of Fate. The messenger's words, "he knew about the watch," echoed in Margaret's mind, a chilling revelation that sent a new wave of questions swirling through her. How could James have known about the watch's backward movement? Had he somehow orchestrated it? Was it connected to his mission, to his sacrifice? She returned to her guest house, her mind racing. She took out the watch, holding it in her palm, feeling its now almost imperceptible ticking. It was slowing down, nearing its destination, its journey through time almost complete. But what was its destination? What was the moment it was returning to? She spread out the map of Beaumont and Verdenoise on the small table in her room, studying the markings, the circled village, the rendezvous point. She realized that the watch's backward movement must be linked to the date on the map, October 26, 1918. The watch was counting down to that moment, to that fateful rendezvous. She decided to travel to Beaumont and Verdenoise, to the place where James had disappeared, to the place where the truth, she hoped, lay buried. She knew it was a dangerous undertaking, but she was driven by a force she couldn't control, a force that was both personal and otherworldly. She hired a car and a driver, a taciturn local who knew the area well. The journey was long and difficult, the roads winding and treacherous, the landscape bleak and desolate. As they approached Beaumont and Verdenoise, Margaret felt a growing sense of dread. The village was a ruin, a collection of shattered buildings and overgrown rubble, a testament to the destructive power of war. It was a ghost town, a place haunted by the memories of the dead. She directed the driver to the church, the building marked on James's map. It was a roofless shell, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, its stained glass windows shattered. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was cold and damp, the scent of decay heavy in the air. She felt a presence, a sense of unseen eyes watching her. She walked to the altar, the place where James had been supposed to meet someone. She looked around, searching for some clue, some sign, some indication of what had happened here. And then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible inscription, carved into the stone floor beneath the altar. It was a symbol, a familiar symbol, a raven. The raven. The symbol of the messenger, of the serpents, of their enemies. It was here, at the rendezvous point, a silent witness to the events that had transpired. She knelt down, tracing the outline of the raven with her finger. As she did so, she felt a sudden jolt, a surge of energy that passed through her body. The watch in her pocket vibrated, its ticking suddenly accelerating, then stopping altogether. The watch had reached its destination. Time had caught up, and in that moment, Margaret understood. She understood the truth about James's mission, about his sacrifice, about the backward ticking watch. She was here to not just understand, but to change what had happened. The threads of fate, once severed, were now in her hands. It was no longer about observation, but action. But what should she do? Chapter 14. The Unseen Wound. The abrupt silence of the watch was more jarring than its incessant ticking. It felt like a held breath, a moment of suspended animation before a cataclysmic event. Margaret stood in the ruined church, the raven symbol beneath her fingertips, the weight of the past pressing down on her. She realized that the watch hadn't just been counting down to the rendezvous, it had been counting down to her arrival at the rendezvous. It was a temporal anchor, a device designed to bring her to this specific place, at this specific time, to witness or perhaps to alter what had happened here. She looked around the church, her eyes scanning the shattered walls, the broken pews, the overgrown rubble. She tried to imagine the scene that had played out here for years ago. James, waiting for his contact, unaware of the danger that lurked in the shadows. She closed her eyes, focusing her mind, trying to connect with James, with his spirit, with the echoes of the past. She felt a presence, a faint whisper of his voice, a sense of his fear, his determination, his love. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. A shadow, a fleeting glimpse of a figure lurking behind a broken pillar. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding. It was the messenger, the man with the raven pin. He was here, watching her, waiting for her. "You," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You knew this would happen. You knew about the watch." The man stepped out of the shadows, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Yes," he said. "I knew. But how?" Margaret asked. "How is this possible?" "Time is fluid," the man said. "It's not a straight line. It can be bent. It can be broken. And sometimes it can be repaired." "Repaired?" Margaret repeated, her mind reeling. You mean we can change what happened? We can save James? The man hesitated.
Perhaps, he said.
But it's dangerous. Very dangerous. There are forces at play, forces that don't want the past to be altered. I don't care, Margaret said, her voice firm. I have to try. I have to save him. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and admiration. You have his courage, he said. His spirit. But you also have something else. Something that he didn't have. What? Margaret asked. The watch, the man said. The watch is the key. It's a conduit, a link between the past and the present. It allows you to interact with the past, to influence events. He paused, looking at Margaret intently. He pointed at a darkened alcove, almost hidden behind rubble. He will come through there. Be ready. The unseen wound, the wound that James had carried, wasn't just a physical wound. It was a wound of betrayal, of deception, of a love lost and a sacrifice made. And Margaret, armed with the watch and the knowledge of the past, was now in a position to heal that wound, to rewrite the story, to give James and herself a second chance. But was it her second chance, or was it his? Chapter 15. Across the barricades. A tense silence filled the ruined church, broken only by the wind whistling through the shattered windows. Margaret stood poised, her gaze fixed on the darkened alcove, her hand clutching the now silent watch in her pocket. The messenger stood beside her, a silent, watchful presence. Suddenly, a flicker of movement, a shadow, coalescing into a form. A man, emerging from the alcove, his figure hazy and indistinct at first, then gradually solidifying. It was James. He looked younger, thinner, his uniform stained with mud and blood, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He was here, transported from the past, from the moment of the rendezvous, to this present, this altered reality. Margaret gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She wanted to rush to him, to embrace him, to tell him everything. But she knew she had to be careful. That one wrong move could unravel the fragile fabric of time. James looked around, his gaze darting from the ruined church to Margaret, to the messenger. He didn't recognize her, not yet. She was older, changed by grief and time, a stranger to him. Where am I? He asked, his voice trembling, his accent thick with the echoes of the past. Beaumont en Verdenoise, Margaret said, her voice catching in her throat. The church. You were supposed to meet someone here. James's eyes widened in recognition. Isabella? He asked, his voice hopeful. Margaret hesitated. She knew she had to tell him the truth, about Isabella's betrayal, about her death, about the double cross that had led to his disappearance. But she also knew that the truth could shatter him, that it could destroy the fragile timeline she was trying to repair. No, she said finally. Not Isabella. Me. Margaret. James stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Margaret? He repeated, the name a foreign sound on his lips. But I'm your wife, Margaret said, her voice firm. From the future. From after the war. James shook his head, disbelieving. That's impossible, he said. It's the truth, Margaret said. And you're in danger, James. You were betrayed. You were set up. She explained, quickly, about Isabella's deception, about the German intelligence, about the double cross. James listened, his expression growing increasingly grave, his eyes filling with a mixture of anger and understanding. The messenger spoke up. He nodded towards a darkened passage. They are coming. Quickly now. Margaret suddenly understood. This wasn't about saving James in the past. This was about saving James now. He'd been brought to her, to the future. She needed to save him from the pursuers who were coming to silence him. But how had they followed him through time? The raven. It wasn't just a symbol. Who? James demanded. Who is coming? The ones who betrayed you, Margaret said. The ones who want you dead. A sudden crash echoed from the entrance of the church. Figures, silhouetted against the fading light, burst into the ruined building. Men in long coats, their faces obscured by shadows, their hands clutching weapons. The past and the present have collided. Chapter 16. The soldiers return. The men fanned out, their movements swift and silent, their eyes scanning the ruined church. They were professionals, trained killers, their intent clear, to eliminate James Calloway, to erase him from history, even in this altered timeline. The raven symbol, Margaret now realized, wasn't just a symbol of an organization, it was a temporal marker, a way for these men to track anomalies, to hunt down those who dared to tamper with time. "James, we have to go," Margaret urged, pulling him towards a side exit, a narrow passage that led to the back of the church. The messenger, surprisingly, stepped forward, positioning himself between Margaret and James and the approaching men. "I'll hold them off," he said, his voice low and firm. "Get him out of here." But Margaret began, her voice filled with concern. "Go," the messenger insisted. "There's no time." Margaret hesitated, but she knew he was right. She grabbed James's hand, pulling him along the passage, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. They emerged into the overgrown graveyard behind the church, the tombstones casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. They ran, stumbling over uneven ground, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They could hear the shouts of the men behind them, the sound of their pursuit growing closer. They were being hunted, chased through time, their escape a desperate race against fate. They reached the edge of the village, the road leading back to Stornoway stretching before them. But their car, their driver, were nowhere to be seen. They were stranded, exposed, with no means of escape. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a familiar figure. It was their driver, the taciturn local who had brought them to Beaumont en Verdenoise. He was holding a rifle, his expression grim and determined. "Get in," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'll take you to a safe place." They scrambled into the car, the driver speeding off, the engine roaring, the tires spitting gravel. They were leaving Beaumont en Verdenoise behind, leaving the ruined church, the ghosts of the past, the pursuers who sought to erase them. As they drove, Margaret looked at James, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. He was a soldier out of time, a man caught in a web of deception and betrayal, a man who had been given a second chance at life.
Who were those men?
James asked, his voice trembling. "They're from a different time," Margaret said. "They're trying to correct a mistake. To prevent you from living." James stared at her, his brow furrowed.
"But why?"
"Because you knew too much," Margaret said. "Because you were a threat. Because they wanted to silence you." She began to explain all she had learned, his eyes slowly coming to terms with this impossible reality. The driver, she realized, was not just a driver. He was part of the network that Davies had mentioned, the network of people who knew the truth, who protected the secrets of the past. He was their ally, their protector, their guide in this strange, altered reality. And it became clear he was somehow related to the messenger. They were cut from the same cloth. They were safe for now. But Margaret knew that the danger was far from over. The raven, the symbol of their pursuers, would continue to hunt them, to pursue them across time, until they were either silenced or victorious. James, the soldier, had returned. But the war, it seemed, was far from over. It had merely shifted to a new battlefield. Chapter 17. Ghosts of Yesterday. The safe house was a remote croft, a small, stone cottage nestled in the rugged hills of the Isle of Lewis, far from the prying eyes of their pursuers. The driver, who introduced himself as Angus, was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He provided them with food, shelter, and a sense of security, a temporary respite from the relentless chase. Margaret and James spent the next few days in the croft, adjusting to their new reality, their forced proximity creating a strange mixture of intimacy and awkwardness. James, still grappling with the shock of his temporal displacement, struggled to reconcile the woman before him with the Margaret he remembered, the Margaret he had left behind. He asked countless questions about the war, about the years that had passed, about the life she had lived without him. Margaret answered as best she could, trying to bridge the gap between their two worlds, trying to rebuild the connection that had been severed by time and betrayal. She showed him photographs, letters, mementos of their life together, tangible reminders of the love they had shared. She told him about her grief, about her struggles, about her slow, painful journey towards healing. James listened, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and wonder. He saw the lines of worry etched on her face, the traces of grief that lingered in her eyes. He realized the toll that his disappearance, his presumed death, had taken on her. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "For everything you've been through. For leaving you alone." Margaret reached out, taking his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You didn't leave me, James," she said. "You were taken from me. But you're here now. That's all that matters." They spent hours talking, sharing memories, rebuilding the shattered fragments of their relationship. They talked about their first meeting, their courtship, their wedding, their honeymoon in Paris. They talked about their dreams, their hopes, their fears. They also talked about the war, about James's mission, about Isabella Moreau, about the betrayal that had led to his disappearance. James recounted the events of that fateful day at Beaumont and Verdenoise, the ambush, the chaos, the feeling of being transported through time, the sudden arrival in the ruined church. He remembered the rendezvous, the expectation of meeting Isabella, the realization that he had been set up. He remembered the faces of his attackers, the men in the long coats, the raven symbols on their lapels.
They were different, he said.
They weren't just soldiers. They were something else. Something unnatural. Margaret nodded, understanding. "They're from the future, James," she said. "They're trying to control time.
To prevent you from changing the past."
James stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But why me?"
he asked.
"Because you knew too much," Margaret said. "Because you were a witness. Because you were a threat to their plans." They were both haunted by the ghosts of yesterday, by the shadows of the past, by the knowledge that their lives had been irrevocably altered by forces beyond their control. But they also found solace in each other's presence, in the rekindled spark of their love, in the hope that they could, together, overcome the challenges that lay ahead. But the Raven's men were sure to keep hunting, and there were no guarantees. Chapter 18. The Heart's Betrayal. The fragile peace of the croft was shattered one evening by the arrival of a message. Angus, returning from a trip to Stornoway, brought news that their pursuers had been sighted on the island, their presence a growing threat. They were closing in, their network of informants and spies tightening the net around Margaret and James. "We have to move," Angus said, his voice grim. "They know you're here." Margaret felt a surge of fear, but also a sense of determination. She wouldn't let them take James again. She wouldn't let them erase him from history. "Where can we go?" she asked. Angus hesitated. "There's a place," he said. "A safe place. But it's dangerous. It's on the other side of the island, near the Callanish Stones." The Callanish Stones. Margaret had heard of them. The ancient standing stones, a prehistoric monument shrouded in mystery and legend. They were said to be a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. "What is this place?" James asked, his brow furrowed. "It's a sanctuary," Angus said. "A place where time bends. A place where you might be able to escape their reach." It was a risky proposition, but it was their only hope. They packed their few belongings, preparing for a perilous journey across the island, a journey that would take them to the heart of the mystery, to the place where time itself was uncertain. As they were leaving the croft, Margaret noticed a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner. She opened it, her heart quickening. Inside, there was a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. She recognized the handwriting on the envelopes. It was Isabella Moreau's. These were letters that Isabella had written to James, letters that had never been sent, letters that had been intercepted by someone, letters that held the key to the final piece of the puzzle. She took the box with her, knowing that it contained vital information, information that could help them understand the full extent of the conspiracy, the true motives of their pursuers. They set off under the cover of darkness, Angus leading the way, their journey a race against time, a flight from the relentless forces that sought to control their destiny. They traveled across the rugged terrain, the wind howling around them, the stars their only guide. As they walked, Margaret began to read the letters, translating them from French, her heart aching with each word. Isabella's letters were filled with passion, with longing, with a desperate plea for forgiveness. But they also revealed a shocking truth. Isabella hadn't just been a German spy. She had been working for both sides, a double agent, caught in a web of deceit and betrayal. And she had been in love with James, deeply, truly in love with him. But there was more. Isabella had discovered the existence of a secret organization, a group that was manipulating the war, controlling events from behind the scenes, an organization that sought to control time itself. An organization symbolized by the raven. The raven, the symbol that had haunted Margaret throughout her journey, the symbol of their pursuers, the symbol of the forces that sought to erase James from history. Isabella had learned too much, and that's why she had been killed. And James, because of his connection to Isabella, because of his knowledge of her activities, had become a target as well. He was considered loose end, one that needed to be dealt with. The heart's betrayal wasn't just Isabella's betrayal of James. It was the betrayal of both of them by a force far greater, far more sinister, than they could ever have imagined. This organization, it became clear, was behind the watch. Chapter 19. A shattered reflection. The Callanish stones loomed before them, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, their ancient presence a stark contrast to the modern-day threat that pursued Margaret and James. The air hummed with an almost palpable energy, a sense of timelessness, of a connection to something beyond human comprehension. Angus led them to a small, hidden chamber beneath one of the largest stones, a secret sanctuary known only to a select few. It was a place of refuge, a place where the laws of time seemed to hold less sway. "This is as far as I can take you," Angus said, his voice low. "You'll be safe here for a while. But they will find you, eventually. They always do." "What do we do then?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Angus looked at James, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and recognition. "You have to undo what was done," he said. "You have to break the cycle." "Break the cycle?" James repeated, his brow furrowed. "What cycle?" "The cycle of betrayal," Angus said. "The cycle of manipulation. The cycle of time travel." He pointed to the watch, still tucked away in Margaret's pocket. "The watch," he said. "It's not just a device. It's a weapon. A weapon that can be used to control time, to alter history. And it's been used for evil." The Raven organization, Angus explained, had been using the watch for decades, manipulating events, controlling outcomes, shaping the world to their own twisted design. They had created the watch and sent the men to get rid of James. James's mission, his disappearance at Verdun, had been a carefully orchestrated event, a part of their larger plan. They had used Isabella, manipulated James, and then sought to eliminate him when he became a liability. But James, somehow, had defied their control. He had survived, his spirit, his essence had been preserved, waiting for the moment when he could be brought back, when he could break the cycle. "You have to destroy the watch," Angus said, his voice firm. "You have to end its power. Only then will you be truly free." Margaret hesitated. Destroy the watch? The watch that had brought James back to her? The watch that was their only link to the past? It seemed like an impossible task, a betrayal of everything she had fought for. But she knew Angus was right. The watch was a dangerous weapon, a tool of manipulation, a source of endless conflict. It had to be destroyed. She took out the watch, holding it in her palm, feeling its cold, metallic surface. It was silent now, its backward journey complete. It was a shattered reflection of time, a broken mirror reflecting the twisted ambitions of the Raven organization. She looked at James, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He nodded, understanding. He knew what had to be done. Together, they walked to the center of the stone circle, the ancient stones standing as silent witnesses to their final act. Margaret raised the watch above her head, and with all her strength, she smashed it against one of the stones. The watch shattered into 1,000 pieces, its intricate mechanism destroyed, its power extinguished. A wave of energy surged through the stone circle, a ripple in time, a disruption of the forces that had sought to control their destiny. The air crackled, the ground trembled, and then silence. The raven's power, its ability to travel, was fractured. They had done it. They had broken the cycle. They had destroyed the watch. They were free, but at what cost? And what of the men hunting them? Chapter 20. Time's Reckoning. The silence that followed the destruction of the watch was profound, a stillness that seemed to permeate the very fabric of the ancient stones. The humming energy that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a sense of peace, of a world returned to its natural order. Margaret and James stood hand in hand, staring at the shattered remnants of the watch, the pieces glittering on the ground like fallen stars. They had broken the cycle, defied the Raven organization, and reclaimed their lives. Or so they thought. Suddenly, the air shimmered, the stones themselves seemed to vibrate, and figures began to materialize around them, emerging from the shadows, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. The men in long coats, the agents of the Raven organization, had found them. Even without the watch's full power, they had managed to track them, their determination to silence James, to maintain their control over time, undiminished. "It's over, Calloway," one of the men said, his voice cold and menacing. "You can't escape us. You can't change the past." James stepped forward, his eyes blazing with defiance. "The past is already changed," he said. "You have no power here anymore." A fight erupted, a brutal clash between the forces of the past and the present, between those who sought to control time and those who sought to be free. James, despite his years of absence, fought with the skill and ferocity of a trained soldier, his movements honed by years of experience in the trenches. Margaret, too, found a strength she didn't know she possessed, using her knowledge of the Raven organization, of their tactics, of their weaknesses, to aid James in the fight. She had spent weeks researching them, understanding them, and now she was using that knowledge to defeat them. Angus, who had seemingly vanished, reappeared, wielding his rifle with deadly accuracy, his knowledge of the terrain and his network of contacts proving invaluable. The battle raged within the stone circle, the ancient stones bearing silent witness to the struggle for freedom, for the right to determine one's own destiny. One by one, the men in long coats fell, their temporal anchors weakened, their connection to their own time severed by the destruction of the watch. They flickered, faded, and disappeared, their bodies dissolving into nothingness, their thread extinguished. The last man, the leader of the group, the one who had spoken, faced James, his eyes filled with hatred and desperation. He lunged at James with a knife, a desperate attempt to complete his mission. But James was ready. He disarmed the man, knocking him to the ground, his foot on the man's chest. "It's over," James said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and relief. "You've lost." The man stared up at James, his face contorted with rage. "You may have won this battle," he spat. "But the war is far from over. There are others who will continue the fight." And then, he too flickered and faded, disappearing into the ether, his threat silenced. The battle was over. The Raven organization, at least this branch of it, had been defeated. Margaret and James were free. They stood together, amidst the ancient stones, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. They had faced the past, confronted the forces that had sought to control them, and emerged victorious. It was time's reckoning. They had changed the past, and in doing so, they had secured their future. But the leader's words echoed, "There are others." But what of the messenger? And Angus, his relative? Where did they disappear? Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of the war, both the Great War and the temporal war they had fought, slowly began to heal. Margaret and James, reunited against all odds, rebuilt their lives, their love deepened by the shared trauma and the impossible journey they had undertaken. They returned to New York, to the brownstone on a quiet street, a place that was once filled with shadows and secrets, now filled with light and laughter. James, though forever changed by his experiences, found a measure of peace, a sense of purpose in his second chance at life. He used his knowledge, his skills, his unique understanding of time to help others, to prevent similar tragedies from occurring. Margaret, too, found a new purpose. She became a historian, a chronicler of the past, dedicated to uncovering the truth, to exposing the hidden forces that sought to manipulate history. She wrote about the Great War, about the serpents, about the Raven organization, her words a warning, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They never forgot Angus, the taciturn driver who had helped them, the man who had been a part of the network, the protector of the secrets of the Callanish stones. They knew he was out there, somewhere, watching over them, guarding the boundaries of time. And they never forgot the messenger, the man with the raven pin, the man who had delivered James's letter, the man who had guided them, warned them, and ultimately helped them to break the cycle. He remained a mystery, a figure shrouded in shadows, a guardian of the past, a traveler between worlds. He never contacted them, and they never sought him out. Some mysteries were best left unsolved. One day, many years later, Margaret was walking through Central Park, enjoying the warmth of the spring sunshine. She saw a familiar figure sitting on a park bench, feeding the pigeons. It was an old man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes the same intense blue as James's. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding. He looked up at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "Hello, Margaret," he said, his voice a low rumble, the Hebridean accent still discernible, though softened by time. It was the messenger. "You," Margaret began, her voice trembling. "I'm here to check on you," the man said. "To see if you're happy." "We are," Margaret said, her eyes filling with tears. "We're happy. We're free." The man nodded, a look of satisfaction on his face.
"Good," he said.
"That's all that matters." He stood up, preparing to leave. Margaret hesitated. Who are you?" she asked, the question she had carried with her for years. The man smiled, a mysterious, enigmatic smile. "A friend," he said. "A messenger. A guardian of time." And he paused, looking at her intently, James's grandfather. And then, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Margaret standing there, stunned, speechless. The truth finally revealed. The backward, ticking watch, the journey through time, the fight for freedom, it had all been a family affair, a legacy passed down through generations, a battle against the forces that sought to control history. Margaret smiled, a tear rolling down her cheek. She finally understood. Time, like family, was a complex, intricate web, a tapestry woven with threads of love, loss, betrayal, and redemption. And she and James, together, had found their place within that tapestry, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. She turned to head home to James, an untold story ready to be shared. The end.